have Adolph Reed, who has the concluding essay in the volume, so your book ended here, in a sense. And Adolph's concluding essay is part of a symposium on labor and the left in the United States. And it's a very sober, very penetrating analysis of the crisis of labor and the left in the United States. And I'm very happy that Adolph was able to come up and join us.
Well, I guess I want to start by saying how happy I am to be here. I'm always quite glad to be in the company of my good comrades in this great city. And in that light, I want to thank Greg and Leo and whoever else was responsible for inviting me up, and also to thank all of you for coming out tonight. We were wondering for a couple minutes, as one always does before something like this, if there'd be more of you out there than there are of us up here, and this is a rousing success. And I got to say too, like, I looked up a few minutes ago and I saw the Cuban flag there, and I can't tell you how inspiring it is to see it, like, especially as something of a Cuban American whose family has always been in support of the revolution, both in the United States and in Cuba. So that's great. And it feels nice to be in a liberated zone. All that said, I guess, I suppose, well, I'm going to be more or less schematic in my comments. The more our article, and by our, my co-author is my longtime comrade and colleague and good friend, Mark Dudzik, who was a longtime activist in the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, president of a local in Jersey for 16 years, and president of the Eastern District Council, and and we were involved together in an enterprise that I guess I'll talk about a little bit in my talk, depending, in the less schematic version. That was an attempt for 15, 16 years to try to build an independent political party of labor in the U.S. So the title of our article is "The Crisis of Labor and the Left in the U.S." The more schematic version of my talk is this. We're fucked. Here, there we go. But I guess after having traveled here by car, train, tram, plane, and boat, today, I should probably say a little more than that. So I think I'll subject you to the less schematic version, which I will begin by uttering the deadliest things a professor can ever say, which is, I'll try to be brief. Our tack in this paper was derived from a couple of overlapping concerns. One of them, as I've already alluded to, is our shared project of more than a decade of trying to build an independent political party of labor, that is to try to advance a working class politics in the United States, and largely, actually, as part of the project, trying to push for, educate toward, propagate, instantiate, embody the kind of more expansive understanding of what the working class is and who the working class are that David and Susan were talking about, like that. The other strain, I guess, from which this article emerges is a concern to try to explain what's happened to the left in the U.S. Over the last 30 years, and then we realized that to do that, we really needed to talk a little bit about what's happened to the left in the U.S. over the last 60 years. And I should say, just as another plug for the Register, I've been reading it since I was 20, which as of yesterday, it was 48 years. So, and the more the merrier. But, or that is of the Register, I'm not sure that the more the merrier for me at all. And I think the sober observation from which we proceed is there is no left in the U.S. that's worth talking about, right? Not if we understand, the left as a systematic set of ideas and institutions rooted organizationally and programmatically with the objective of changing policy and power relations in American politics. There is no such thing. There hasn't been one for quite a while, right? In fact, granted, I have the senior moments now, but there hasn't been one for almost longer than I can remember. And that's a problem. But an even bigger problem is the fact that the left is so defeated in the States and so demoralized that people don't even recognize or won't permit themselves to recognize that there is no left. So we do a lot of walking around in circles. We do a lot of going through the motions of acting as though there were a grounded social and political movement that exists. We issue pronunciamentos, we have meetings, we are quick, and especially with the emergence of the internet, to pronounce the next great thing, right? Just over the hill, or if there are any anthropologists in the room, there's a ship carrying a wonderful cargo just beyond the horizon. You can't see it yet, but when it gets here, we'll have a big bonfire on the beach. But it's not enough to kvetch about that, really. I mean, like, the real question is, well, how do we change it? And what we realized was that part of trying to figure out how to change it is to try to suss out how we wound up in this position, right? I mean, Mark is a little bit younger than I am, but we both grew up in the post-war era in a moment when it seemed that it was possible for us to win things, and we did win things as a movement, right? So what happened? Well, our argument is that what in stages has become more visible or has become increasingly visible as a defeat of the left in the U.S. over the last 30 years really began with the critical defeat at the end of World War II. This kind of overlaps a bit with the other thread that sort of comes together in this article. I can't even call it a shameless plug, but there's a book that I've been working on for Verso for some time that began as an examination of the Obama mania phenomenon, which was really animated by the question, why did so many people who should have known better get swept up in the irrational exuberance around this guy who was really just an ordinary neoliberal Clinton Democrat. And as part of trying to answer that question, I wound up at the same point, actually, that the route to understanding that, or to explaining that conundrum, is exactly the same as the route to explaining what the decline and transformation of the left in the U.S. And increasingly, I think the transformation is just as important and just as corrosive, actually, as the decline part. So our account isn't really, we hope it doesn't come across as a fall from grace narrative or a j'accuse, right? Because we're not trying to identify the labor fakers who traduced the real working class movement. What we show is that, beginning with FDR's enunciation of the Second Bill of Rights, a full employment bill in 1945 that would have required the president to take aggressive steps in including public works jobs if employment rose above an acceptable threshold, which people at the time generally considered to be 3%, and the more radicals thought, take 3 as an immediate goal and bargain down to 2. But even more meaningfully, I think, than than those moments of expression from political elites was an expression of public opinion. A Roper poll taken, I think, within a month of, I believe, the 1946 election, it might have been 44, but I think it was 46, found actually that 69% of the respondents, so that is Americans in the sample, said that they would not support any political and economic system, no matter what it was called, that didn't guarantee a right to a job to anybody who was willing to work. By the end of the 1950s, polls found, mirabile dictu, that Americans were mainly concerned about inflation, and that was the greater problem. What happened between 1946 and 1960 was, among other things that nobody ever talks about, was like a systematic public information and propaganda campaign, public education campaign, by the advertising industry and the corporate elite to pump this, or to create this notion of public opinion. But more than that, right? The initial punchline is that, between 1944 and the end of the 1940s, there was like a struggle in American politics between the labor, liberal, civil rights-oriented left and capitalists. And the long and short of it is that they won, which is most likely to happen most of the time, right? I mean, you will always do better if you bet on the ruling class to win. Over time. And what happened then? But what we came to think of as the grand bargain, right? And what the social scientists trumpeted over the next decade to 2 decades as a special American capitalism, or an American exceptionalism that has, a capitalism. We're not even sure we should call it capitalism anymore. We might have to call it something like industrial society, or Johnny Mathis. We could call it that even if you want. But that has no more class contradictions, right? That the promise of perpetual economic growth has resolved class conflict, right? But all this came, we argue, on the foundation of having of the defeat of the labor movement, right? And the defeat of a broader working class movement that was hemmed in, as Nelson Lichtenstein argues, in both occupational and geographical archipelagos. So it couldn't expand into the sectors of the economy where employment was expanding for the decade and a half to 2 decades after World War II, and was preempted partly because of Taft-Hartley, but also for other reasons, from expanding into the South and the West. So it was trapped, basically. We see also, a law professor named Lisa Goluboff, I think is the University of Virginia, has a great book on this called The Lost Promise of Civil Rights, that examines how civil rights litigation from the late 1930s to the mid-1940s focused as much on reading the 13th Amendment as a labor, I forget I'm not in the U.S., and it wouldn't matter if I were in the U.S., because people would know. But the 13th Amendment to the Constitution is the amendment that abolished slavery and involuntary servitude. Okay? But she demonstrates that there was a pattern of litigation, ironically coming mainly out of the civil rights section of the Federal Justice Department, that focused on pursuit of black employments and of income rights from the standpoint of the constitutional prohibition of involuntary servitude, which in red, racial inequality in political economic terms. It was also clear from the programs and the orientations of Popular Front-oriented black activists like A. Philip Randolph and others, that even actually conservatives had an understanding by the end of World War II that advancing blacks' civil rights agenda depended necessarily on a strong CIO and Congress of Industrial Organizations, a strong trade union movement, and expansion of the social welfare apparatus, right? Make a long story short, what happened over the 1950s is through a variety of carrots and sticks with respect to both the labor movement and black political agitation. The political economic component of the civil rights movement just kind of, to the extent that it didn't drop out of discussion entirely, took a backseat to the 14th Amendment's liberal protection of due process and of equal protection before the law, and thus focused on the challenge to codify racial segregation in the South, which was necessary to defeat. I wouldn't quibble about that, but to the extent that the center of gravity of black political action shifts away from political economy, even ironically, like the emergence of a notion of working class well-being that was disconnected from collective processes and from collective goods, and impelled by the post-war housing boom and the propagation of individual home ownership. And again, going back to the academics, redefinition of class in a way that disconnected it from social location in a production system to become like a matter of culture, right? The kind of stuff you eat, the kind of I can remember this from when I was an undergraduate. Some jerk off had a living room scale. I don't know if you remember, Dick, because it was somebody in Soch who measured class by the kind of crap you had, by the kind of crap you had in your living room, right? So class becomes ethnicity, which also becomes Catholicism, which also is culture. So, and I know that I'm being maybe overly schematic about this, but I'm also a little concerned about time. But what we see, all right, so the big punchline of our historical account is that from several different strains of insurgent politics at the end of World War II, what happens by the mid-1960s or the end of the 1960s is that along the way, each of them has, each strain of challenge has like shifted farther and farther away from roots in capitalist production relations or political economy, period, and toward culture. So it's not surprising, like from this standpoint, by the mid-1960s we get Black Power, which is a different kind of class program, and maybe I'll just toss that out as a provocation. So, there's a dynamic of political class consolidation that goes on in Black American politics and in other strains of the new interest groups, I guess you could call them, such that the identity categories are in effect agencies of articulation of different strains of the ideology of the new the professional and managerial strata. So then it's no surprise that by the time we get to the 80s and toward the 90s, as capacities for extramural political insurgency, that is, the insurgency in the society outside the academy, go into deeper retreat, then forms of left expression become more prominent inside the university that are all about culture and expression of identity. So that kind of gets us to where we are when the Clinton administration just made helped to etch like the new fault line in national politics at the partisan level, where we have, and this is what we have now clearly, is one neoliberal party that's committed to diversity and another neoliberal party that's opposed to diversity. And that's like the fulcrum, right, of American politics now, and it has been for a while. So it's in this context, spurred also by NAFTA and other defeats that the labor movement had, that a group of trade union activists and their unions it began like in the early 1990s, undertook to try to figure out if there's some way that we could develop like an independent working class voice in American politics. And that's what we spent the next 15 years trying to do. And in Q&A, if you want to talk about that and what happened to it and where it stands or stood, I'll be happy to do it. But I think I've used my time, so I'll stop right here.